Hi class, in this video we're going to be going over creating rewards for a game in Godot. So we'll design some rewards, make a couple animations for the default state of the reward and then collecting the reward. Then we'll add it into Godot using some default scenes for an item and for adding a life. Then we'll do some documentation. We'll just post our sprite sheets on the OpenLab. So let's get started. So we'll start out in Pascal. And the first thing I want to do is save my file. So I want to save a Pascal file that I'll be able to edit later. So I'll call this reward underscore apple, and I'll save that. And so then I'll get started by creating a little guideline. So I'm just going to use a circle and use that as the basis for the apple shape. And then I'll just center that and turn on the onion skin. This way I can draw over the circle and draw my apple with a nice little guide. So I'm going to choose a red color and draw the outline of the apple. And this is going to be pretty simple. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Depending on how complex your reward is, you might want to try different things. But the main thing we want to do is choose a color that's going to stand out from the rest of the design. And the rest of my scene has a lot of green and brown. So I'm choosing red, which has a lot of contrast from green. And then I also want to make it move around a little bit. There's a few different things you could do here. I'm just going to have a little stem that kind of rotates around. So it'll look like the apple is rotating in space. This isn't super realistic, but it will draw a little bit of attention to the apple so the player notices it and might suspect that since the scenery is not animated, it might give them a sense that the apple being animated is something that they can interact with. So I made a few different attempts here to work on the leaves. I wanted to add some green leaves to give some more contrast and brightness to the apple design. And working in pixel art, you don't have a lot of options. There's not that much data to work with. So you can see I had a few different attempts here. And I was also working on some shading, and I spent a little bit of time kind of playing around with the different shading and different leaves before I got something that really worked. So I'm including these sped up just so you can kind of see what my process was like, but you'll see my final version that I created after these. So here I started over again. I actually changed the stem color to make it stand out a little bit more. And I tried a couple different things with the shading and the leaves. And I just want to make a very simple animation. So I decided to start over. So I'm using the lighten tool to add some light shading to the left and some dark shading to the right. Once I was happy with the shading, I duplicated my apple 3 times. So I have 4 total frames, and I'm just going to change the stem in each frame to make it look like the apple is rotating around. Now that I've got the stem moving around, that looks pretty good. And now I want to add in a leaf that's kind of rotating around with the stem just to kind of reinforce that animation so it looks like the apple is kind of moving around in space. Once I was happy with the animation, I sort of realized that the shading looks kind of weird if it just stays the same the whole time the apple is rotating. So I went back and drew over the shading and then added it back in. So now I want to export my sprite sheet. I'm going to go to the export tab and click download. I realized that I saved my original Pascal inside the character animation folder, but I really want to create a new folder for rewards. So I'm going to do that now and then save the sprite sheet in there, and I'll move the Pascal file in there later. So now I'm done with the idle animation for the apple. I want to create another animation for when the character collects the apple. And we are going to remove the apple from the scene. And so I'm just going to kind of erase some parts of the first frame of the apple. So that's just going to be a really simple way to create kind of a collected animation. So I'll just take the first frame and duplicate it and erase a little bite out of it. And then I'll duplicate from there and erase another little bite. And then I'll keep going until the apple is gone. I don't need a frame with no apple in it because we will remove the entire item from the scene once the player has collected the apple. So it will fully disappear once the object is removed from the scene. So that's a really simple way to do a collected animation. You could do a lot of other things depending on what your reward is. Since mine's an apple, it makes sense to kind of animate the character eating it. So let's save that reward apple collected in the same folder. And now we can move on to our life. So for the life item, I'm gonna start this with reward _ life, and this will make it so that my files are saved in the same place. So let's save the reward life in the rewards folder. And for this one, I'm just gonna draw a heart. That's pretty typical for what you might expect to see if you lose a life and then need to gain a life back. You might see a heart, and I'm just gonna do a really simple animation where the heart is sort of pulsing or beating like a heart would. So I want to choose a color, something in the red or pink or purple range. And so that will stand out again from the rest of our art. So it'll kind of stand out in contrast to the apple, as well as the green grass and brown dirt and the other scenery that I'm using. So then for the animation, I'm going to do something really simple. I'm just going to duplicate these frames, and I'm just going to make the heart a little bit bigger in each frame. So I'll just kind of draw and add on to the outline. So this is a really simple approach. And when you're making game art, I definitely recommend finding ways to simplify your approach so that it's easy to make changes and update things, and you can test how things look really quickly. You could obviously spend hours and hours creating the perfect animation, but if you ultimately decide that it doesn't look right or you want to change the item altogether, then it's better to kind of prototype things quickly and see how they look. And then if you want to spend more time on them in the future, you can do that and make them look exactly how you want. But for now, this is pretty good. You get the impression of a heart, and it's sort of moving, and it looks like it's beating a little bit. And I think that will work. So I want to save that file, and then I want to download my sprite sheet. So I'm going to click on the export menu and click download, and that'll create a sprite sheet. So next we want to make a collected animation. So I'm going to save my file as a new file, reward life collected, and make sure to click save as. And for this one, I'm just going to do like a little dissolve effect. So I'll duplicate my frame and I'll use the eraser to just take out a bunch of different pixels. And I'll keep doing that until there's nothing left. So I'm just going to kind of erase a bunch of random pixels. And again, there's no wrong way to do this. You can do lots of different stuff. You could just kind of erase different parts of the heart. You could have the heart shrink. You could have the heart explode, whatever you want to do to just show the user that the heart has disappeared. And then we'll show in the UI that they've gained a life. And so that'll be enough to communicate to the user what happened. So I'm just going to keep duplicating these frames and erasing different pixels until the heart is gone. And so for the last frame, I just have like a few dots. I don't need to have a completely blank frame because again, we can remove the object from the scene. So once we go through the animation, the object will disappear altogether. So I'm going to download that sprite sheet and save the file as well so I can edit it later if I need to. And now we should be good to go. So in our rewards folder, we should have 4 sprite sheets, 2 for the apple animations and 2 for the life animations. And I'm going to zip these up in a little zip folder so I can share them with a developer or a designer if they want to use them in their game. Now that we have the art for our rewards, we can look at how to put them into a Godot project, and we can use the pre-built item and life scenes that are part of the artist default or the assets folder. There's a couple ways that you could do this. If you're working on a game project where you're putting everything in here, you could just go to your game and put those in the sprite folder. If you already have the artist default project, you could put them in there, or you could download it from the lab page and put that into your artist folder. If you're working on a game, but you don't have the right assets, for example, the scenes that we need are the item scene and the life scene. So if you download the default assets and go into the example scenes, you can find the life scene and the item scene. So if you add those into your own Godot project, you should have the basics set up, and then you can just add in your art. So there's a few different ways you can do it. If you're not sure what the best approach is, let me know and we can go over it. I'm gonna use the artist default project that I have here for now. And so to get this set up, I'm gonna go to my rewards, and I have 4 sprite sheets here. So I could copy these, or I could take my reward zip and add it into my sprites folder. So I'm just gonna select each one of these and copy those. And then I'll go back to artist default, go to my sprites folder. You can see I have my background and characters and some other things already in here. And I'm just gonna hit Command V or Control V on Windows to paste. And so now you can see my rewards, and they should all be next to each other if they have reward at the beginning. So now I'll be able to add those into the scenes that I have. So I'm gonna open up project.godot. And I want to go into my scenes folder. I'm going to start with the item scene, so I'll open that up. And I want to zoom in on this, so I'm going to zoom in and center this. And you can see there's a little collider there, so Godot will know when our player overlaps with the item, but there's no art, and so that's what we have to fill in. And so we can see the hierarchy of our item scene over in the scene view, and it's got everything it needs. We can see the animated sprite has a little warning, and that's because we don't have any sprite frames. So that's all we have to do here is just add in our sprite frames. And if you've already done the character animation lab, this should be pretty straightforward. It's pretty much the same thing. So to add in the sprite frames, we go over to the inspector, click on the frames empty, and select new sprite frames. And then I have to click on the sprite frames again to bring up my animation window. So we need 2 basic animations here. One we'll call item. You could also call it default. It actually doesn't really matter. And that's the animation that it'll be set to when we start. We also need a collected animation. If we click on the script and look at this line in the code, you can see that it's looking for an animation called collected. And so you could change that if you wanted. It'll work as long as what we call in our code matches what we create in our animation window. So let's go back to our animated sprite. So I'm going to delete the default animation, and I'm going to create 2 new animations, clicking the new animation button. So I'm going to make the idle animation and the collected animation. And we just have to make sure that the idle animation is the one that's on when we're done editing. So to add in the sprite sheet, I want to use this waffle button to add frames from a sprite sheet. So I'll click on that, go to sprites, get my Apple sprite sheet, and then we have to select the frames. So there's 4 frames. There's 2 horizontal and 2 vertical. There's split into 2 rows and 2 columns. So we set horizontal to 2 and vertical to 2. And then I just select these frames and add 4 frames. And we don't see it in the preview window yet. So let's make sure we set the animation to idle. Now we can see the animation, and if we want to change the speed, we can do that down here, but that looks pretty good, so I'll stick with that. Next, I'll go to collected and click on the waffle and get our collected animation. And this one actually has 5 frames. There are 2 columns and 3 rows, so I'll do 2 horizontal and 3 vertical, and then select each one of my frames. And let's change the animation just to preview that. And that looks pretty good. We don't want this one to loop because the animation will just be removed once this is done. So I'm going to turn off loop. And so now if I want to preview it, I need to set the frame back to 0. And I might need to turn off playing to do that. So it's a little tricky to preview the animation if it's not looping. So I'll turn playing on. That looks pretty good. I could slow that down a little bit so that it takes some more time. So maybe I'll try a speed of 3. And turn animation off, turn the frame back to 0, and try it again. So I think that looks pretty good. Now I just want to change the animation back to idle to make sure that that's what plays when we first open the scene. And so that's everything I need to do for my item. let's do the same thing with my life scene. So I'm going to go back to my scenes folder, find the life, and open that up. And we're going to just repeat the exact same step. So I won't talk about this one in quite as much detail. So let's click on the animated sprite, create new sprite frames, click on the sprite frames, delete the default, add in an idle and a collected animation. Now set up the idle using the sprite frames waffle button. This one only has 3, so I have 2 horizontal and 2 vertical. And let's preview that. Now let's do the collected. This one should not loop, and we might want to make it a little slower. Let's set the animation back to idle, and now we're done with the life scene. So we basically just repeated the same steps. So if we want to preview this for documentation or just to make sure that it works, we can go to our default scene, and you can see I've got some scenery, some backgrounds, some things from the other lessons in here. And so let's just add in a couple items. So I'm going to go to my scene view, I'm going to right click on the default scene and add a child node and add a 2D, node 2D. I'll just call this items. I'm going to drag this above the player so they appear beneath the player. And then I'm going to use the instance child scene and put in an item. And it's behind the player right now. So let's lock the player up. And then I can move this item down here. And you can see the animation is working. So that looks pretty good. Let's test the life. So I'm just going to do another instance child scene, type in life and select the life. And then we can drag that one down here as well. And so those both look pretty good. If we want to see how they look in the game, we can open this up. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to take a screenshot because I know I'm going to do some documentation. And then if I collect the item, I can see what that looks like. So you could take a video if you want to document that as well. But that's looking pretty good, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to save that, and let's go to OpenLab to post. So once I'm at the OpenLab, I'm going to create a new post. I want to start by adding the category. So I can type in rewards or find it here. And now I'll add a little title. You may want to write a little explanation to explain what rewards you chose to add into the game or what your art represents. And then I'm going to add in my screenshot to show the rewards in the game. And then I'll add in my sprite sheets. So I'll go back to my rewards folder and just grab all of these and drag them in. And let's change the number of columns, and don't want to crop the images. Let's preview this. And so that looks pretty good. You could even do 4 columns here, probably. Maybe we can try that. That looks pretty good. We could also label these and move them around. So adding the labels seems to screw up the layout a little bit. So you could add the images separately. I'm just going to leave this as is. I think it's pretty straightforward what these are. So once I've got my page looking the way I want to, I'm going to hit publish.